my name is Jay Newton-Small, and I'm co-founder of MemoryWell, and this is Andrew Freibush, my co-founder and CTO. You're going to hear from him in a minute. So my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was still a junior in college. Still just the idea of becoming the Time magazine correspondent that I would become was kind of a twinkle in my eye. And about 6 years ago, my mother died, and I became my father's caregiver, and I moved him into a home here in Washington. And they asked me to fill out a 20-page questionnaire about his life. And I remember sitting in this room, handwriting out all these questions, thinking, A, you're never going to be able to understand my handwriting, and B, no one's ever going to read this because it's just who reads 20-page questionnaires anymore? And sure enough, in the years after, when my father was in that home, no one actually ever did read those questionnaires. You saw them in binders sitting there gathering dust. Instead, I took the questionnaire and I handed it back to them and I said, hey, I'd actually just rather write down his story. And they were like, really, you're weird. And I was like, no, I'm a journalist, it's what I do, I write stories. And they were like, all right, you can give it a try if that's what you really want to do. So I wrote down his story and they loved it. It completely transformed his care. His caregivers understood him. Two of his caregivers were actually from Ethiopia. He was originally, he had spent 20 years doing development work in Africa for the United Nations, and they would sit with him for hours and show him photos of Haile Selassie and Addis Ababa. And so the home was like, wow, that's amazing. Can you do this for everyone here? So my dad was one of 14 million people in America living with dementia today, and that number is going to triple by the year 2030. But we have a huge shortage of caregivers coming down the pike, as Andrew will tell you about in a second. Studies show, and there's actually more than 20 studies that have been done on this, that if telling life stories actually really improves the care of those living with Alzheimer's and dementia. And so they found, for example, that it reduces the amount of depression of those suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia. It creates bonds with caregivers, empathy, and it actually even increases empathy between family members and those people living with Alzheimer's and dementia just by telling those stories. And so we started a company, MemoryWell, that basically tells the life stories of those living with Alzheimer's and dementia. And we created a website where each of their stories is anchored on a page, and their loved ones can upload their favorite music and art and videos and readings. So that way, whomever is sitting with them, whether it's caregivers or family members, have a whole toolbox of things with which to engage them. Andrew?
So care is not just a medical thing, but it's intensely personal. What drew me to MemoryWell was my experience with my parents' hospitalization and eventual death. And I spent quite some time basically in the hospital, and the moments that really stay with you are the moments of just little bits of human empathy. Whether it's a nurse that I'd been with for a few months, so she saw me alone and brought me a milk carton, whether it's snuck-in visits that technically violated policy but weren't really an issue. Those are sort of the human-to-human connection that makes healthcare actually care. And this person-centered care is sort of where the entire industry is arcing towards. It's actually written into the ACA, which hopefully will survive. We are short 1.3 million caregivers in this country, and they have an average turnover of about 50%. So just imagine if your job was to look after people, some of whom can't speak, some of whom turn violent, like Jay's dad did at times, and all you have to know anything about them is 20 pages of multiple choice questions or, open response in Jay's handwriting, which does not quite befit a Times journalist. It's going to get worse. In 3 years, we're going to have 2 million, and the baby boomers are not just arcing towards retirement, but towards where they're going to need care. It's impossible to care about someone if you don't know them, and people are their stories. When you know stories about someone, you know who they are. So we're going to solve this by letting storytellers tell stories. We are MemoryWell, and we are more than 200 professional journalists and growing that are producing what caregivers tell us they need. We are labor-saving in a market that is starved for labor. We are person-centered in a market that is going to be person-centered. We are MemoryWell, we tell stories, we improve care, and we give voice to the voiceless. If anyone has a loved one whose story needs to be told or has connection to homes, please talk to us.